Hello and welcome to part 2 in the series of Understanding Depression. My name's Steve Criscall, and what I present here is based on 15 years of practical experience of working as a counselling therapist in the British National Health Service, in mental health services and in private practice. So hopefully from part 1 you've already learned something about what depression actually is, why it's a problem, and how depression works, or something of that. So in part 2 I will talk about some basic facts about depression that we should all know. We'll look deeper into some common features of depression, and finally what we can do to help with depression, either in those of us who may be suffering from depression or in others. So to begin with, perhaps the most fundamentally important thing we can do is probably the simplest, which is that we all gain an understanding of the realities of depression. Now that's the primary purpose of this vidcast, really. So here are some things to know to get us started. Know that depression is a serious condition. Potentially, that is. It could be mild, moderate or severe. Also, we need to have an understanding of what it's like to be depressed, so that we can have a sense of empathy, at least in some ways, for those people who may be suffering. We need to have some understanding of a few important facts about depression, which is what we're doing now. We need to learn something of the process and the mechanisms of depression, which we've already covered. We need to learn something about the causes as well, and how to react to those who experience depression, and know where we can get help from, whether it be which professionals that might be or whatever, and just generally need to learn to recognize the signs of depression in others. Okay, so first of all then, let's have a look at some basic facts about depression. To begin this second part of understanding depression, I want to begin by giving some of these basic facts that I've experienced during the time I've been working as a therapist over many years. I've had many clients who suffer depression, of course. I might also add that I've had my own personal experiences with depression, even though I would say that I only experienced like mild depression, but that occurred sort of over many years, and I've not had any recurrence of that now for 8 years or more. So before I begin to talk about these things, I'd just like to point out that there are many people who believe that depression is an organic problem with the brain. Organic in the sense that it is a physical deficiency, either a chemical or a problem in the physical nature of the brain, or something along those lines. Now, while I'm in no doubt that this is true for a very small proportion of sufferers, it's my belief that this idea has been vastly over-exaggerated as a cause, largely due to poor research, I think, and also a bias towards the pharmaceutical method of treatment, which is a much simpler and less costly method of intervention. So, just give somebody some pills and that's that. Very little effort from the medical profession to do that. I mention this simply as a caveat for those people who are hearing the points that I'm going to talk about, and they might say that my comments don't actually cover organic-based depression, which is actually true. So let's continue. The following points then are probably the most pertinent for everyone to know about depression. They're fairly straightforward, and they may seem a little obvious, but they need to be said, and we need to take them on board. So, first of all, depression always has a start point or a cause, even if that cause isn't known. That's something that people really they wake up in the morning and they think, I've got, if they realize I'm not feeling good today, or I feel terrible today, and they don't know the reason why, well, there will be a reason. It's just that you're not aware of what it is right now. And that, as part of the process of maybe doing therapy, is something that you will learn to uncover. Depression is also usually a reaction to something. Now, it could be linked with a method of thinking that you've had, or a belief system, or whatever, or it's a reaction to something that's happened and the way that you've reacted to that. But it is a reaction to something. It's not just something that pops up out of the blue, like magic. It isn't like that. And another point, really, again, it's a psychological result as opposed to that organic thing that I was talking about earlier. Now, some forms of depression can be linked to trauma. That could be a recent trauma or a long time in the past. And as I think we mentioned this in part one, it could be a single event or a series of events which have happened over a long period of time. And that trauma can be a variety. It may not be trauma. It may be some form of abuse or something along those lines. I think perhaps the most important thing to realise at this stage is, and I mean the most important thing especially for everyone really, but for the person who is suffering from it, is a very simple statement, and that is depression can be beaten. So now it's time for us to look at some of the common features of depression as opposed to what we were just talking about. We need to look at aspects or features of the condition. So we've looked at the hows, the whats and the whys of depression, but we really haven't looked at what it feels like to be depressed. So what I've done is I've chosen some of the most common aspects of being depressed to look at in more detail, just to try and get a feel for what it's like to suffer from this condition. Now, as I talk about each point, just try to imagine what it must be like to be caught up in an emotional turmoil where many or all of these things are all happening all at once. Well, I warn you, it's not a pleasant experience. So if I begin then, the first one is, you can call it being trapped. Now, these are not in any order, by the way, so I'm just picking them at random. Once this feeling begins, or rather once the depression begins, the feeling of being trapped is overwhelming. Now, it's very hard to describe that unless you've actually been, and I think most of us have been in a situation where we've been stuck somewhere. I certainly know I have. Like you're in a tight spot and you just physically can't move. Now, it could be like a crowd of people or just a tight space. And what happens is you get this fear and panic and an overwhelming urge to want to break free. Now, just to give you my own personal example, I for one personally, I hate the idea of underground caves, like where you go exploring and you're going through really tight and enclosed spaces, and often it's pitch black and all you've got is maybe the light on the torch on your helmet or something. That feeling of not being able to move and not being able to escape and not being able to get out, that is the kind of thing that induces this terrifying panic about being trapped. But for the person suffering depression, well, there's more than that. Here's a few quotes I can remember from my work with clients. They would say things like, "There's no way out." And another one is, "I just keep going around and around in circles in my head." Or another one, "It's like a deep dark pit and there are no doors and windows. And I just feel like I'm sinking deeper and deeper. And I'm scared that this will never end." So those are just some of the aspects of feeling trapped. If we look at another one, the next one I would look at is a sense of being helpless and hopeless. As we've said before, said at the end of the part one, that there was an important question that I heard most often from clients, and that was simply asking why. And the why is meaning, why is this happening to me? Now, of course, it's a big problem, and the big problem is that they can't understand or see the answer to that. And in fairness, if and when they go to see a therapist, the therapist doesn't have the answer either, because there is no stock answer as to why you as an individual are suffering from depression. We can know the mechanics as we're doing now, and we can learn about it, but the real, the nub of it all, if you like, is an extremely personal thing. Right, so to find the answers to why, you've got to look and see together. So in the midst of all the darkness that we talked about a moment ago, is this desperate sense that comes from not knowing. It often produces this deep sense of hopelessness, that there's just no point. What I'm struggling every day, I'm trying to work it out, but nothing seems to be working. So this feeling, this heavy rock on my shoulders weighing me down, it just sits there. And then comes the helplessness, the belief and the understanding that you can't do anything about this. You feel powerless. It's something about not having control over this condition, this feeling that you might have. And it just leads you to belief that there's nothing you can do to make it stop. That takes us neatly to the next point. We've mentioned it once already, once or twice, and that is about circular thinking. It's a very, very common part of depression is circular thinking. And sometimes I refer to it also as spiral thinking, because it's not just about going around and around and around and never finding a way out, but it's also a spiraling downwards, because not only can you not find your way out, but the more that continues, it's like you're digging a bigger and deeper hole for yourself, and so that tends to spiral down and the feelings grow and grow and grow. I think we've all heard the phrase catch-22. Well, in case not, here's a quote that I found which seems to describe it well enough. It's a dilemma or difficult circumstance from which there's no escape because of mutually conflicting or dependent circumstances. Yeah, that's from a book somewhere. So the phrase catch-22, it actually comes from a novel written by Joseph Heller in 1961. Eventually it was into a film. And it simply refers to a situation where a person finds themselves caught in a situation from which they can't escape. Because whatever you do, it always leads to the same conclusion. So in the case of depression, the person knows that they need to feel happier, but forcing a smile or trying to bury the down feelings, they never work because they're not real. They're simply a mask over the real feelings. So the real feeling continues because the solution, the reason for the depression, is still a mystery. And so, back to being depressed, and that's catch-22. And of course we get the same questions are asked again, like that big one, why? No answer to that. Sense of worthlessness is another feeling that comes to the fore, and it's just like it's the culmination of other feelings of just utter worthlessness. I'm useless. Self-blame. You know, we could say to ourselves, if I was stronger, I could fix this, and that's self-deprecating. That's you saying something that you about yourself. You know, blaming yourself, and then of course, the pit deepens. That's back to the spiral thinking. Another fairly common, very common aspect of depression is what I term shut down. Now, everyone's different. The way that everybody deals with depression is also different. And sometimes the depth of depression leads a sufferer to the point where they just can no longer function on a day-to-day basis. I mean, the results of that can be varied. We mentioned it in part one. We talked about isolation, staying in bed, but there are other ways, such as a refusal to communicate. You know, you could just sit in your chair staring at a wall, or maybe just staring at the TV or whatever, but just sitting in solitude in a quiet place, not saying anything, not integrating or communicating with others. Something less common, but I have experienced it in a few clients, and that is psychosis. Now, psychosis is it's a psychiatric term it's when the mind slips into another reality. And so a person might begin talking to imaginary people, or begin talking as if they were in a completely different environment. That's one way of hallucinating. Another one is hallucinating, which is again not uncommon. I've experienced people who've experienced being stuck in like an adjustment disorder, like abnormal bereavement, and they were convinced that they were actually seeing their dead husband or wife. In reality, that was a hallucination, something they generated themselves. After some weeks of working with these clients, the hallucinations stop as they finally realize that this actually was part of their bereavement process, and they begin to move on. So psychosis is a state of consciousness that our mind can slip into at a moment's notice, and you can return just as quickly. So it will seem very real to the person experiencing it. Another aspect or another way of shutting down is paranoia. Now, we often hear the word paranoid, and it tends to get thrown around quite a lot without any true, real understanding of what it means. So let's look a little bit more at paranoia, because it's like your rational thinking is impaired in some way, and your clarity of thought is cloudy, is not working as it should do. And then when these things are happening, the mind is capable of creating all manner of unusual phenomena. And paranoia is a state that where a person, they hold deeply held beliefs that persecution will arise against them. And there's nothing to base that on, no evidence as such. It's just a belief that comes into their mind, and it becomes such a strong and deeply held belief that that everything else revolves around that. So you could take an analogy, if you like, a fairly ridiculous one, of taking 2, add 2, and believing the answer is 96. It's quite a how can I say, it's a very unusual phenomenon, but it does happen. Another one, which is not the same, is delusions. Now, similar to paranoia, except that delusions are more wide-ranging beliefs. They go beyond things like persecution, but they're just as false. So it's often misused in general language to describe somebody who holds a belief that's quite obviously false to other people. But a delusion is, again, it's one of those things that comes as a result of the excessive turmoil in the mind. And perhaps the other big issue that I want to talk about is you could term it the final solution. It is the final solution because suicide is a very final event. Now, hopefully you followed through the previous points that I've mentioned, so you'll notice that there is kind of a progressive element here. There's a natural progression which leads to what the sufferer of depression might eventually see as the only sensible recourse. Now, and that's suicide. Well, to you and me who are not suffering from depression, that seems ridiculous. That why would a person, or how could a person come to the conclusion that killing themselves was a sensible or the only recourse? And I can only say to you that I wouldn't wish this upon you, but you need to be going through it yourself, and then you will see that to come to that conclusion is not that difficult, especially when you consider the depth of the feelings that we've been talking about. The sense of hopelessness, it becomes so deeply rooted that it becomes just part of the reasoning process that makes suicide seems like the only option. But often, when that ultimate decision is reached, it's been well thought through, and it's been reasoned as being best for everyone concerned. That would be one of the justifications for it. And again, once that decision has been made, often there's a sense of relief that the person will feel, knowing full well that very soon all of this is just going to go away. Reasoning is impaired, conscience, feelings about family, all change. Everything is different. If you have a family, for example, and you can justify it to yourself and say, well, I'm putting myself out of their misery. They won't have to put up with me anymore, and things along those lines. Yeah. And of course, that's the idea, is that they just want to make it all go away, make it stop. So I just want to, at this point then, just to sort of ram this point home. I've had a personal experience with suicide, not in myself, but in a colleague that I was working with. Now, so I'll just very briefly tell you the outline of this. So while I was working in the British NHS, the health service, I had the grave misfortune to experience one of my colleagues who committed suicide. Now, he was a good man. He was determined to do his job well. He was a senior practitioner in his profession, and he was in a position of supervising a number of health staff. Now, he had no problems in his personal life. He enjoyed the pursuits that a lot of people do, watching football and family life and all of that sort of thing. He was a well-liked guy, and he got on well with everybody. The big issue was that his pressure of work was enormous, and after the event, the NHS managed to absolve itself of any blame. But his depression and subsequent suicide was actually a direct result of his workload and his sense of personal responsibility for his job, for the work that he was doing, and the people who he was supervising and looking after in that way. So as I look back on what happened, I can see a number of things coming from this. So it's kind of evaluating it, if you like. That a good person, and you can take this and think about people that you know, or maybe yourself even. So a good person with integrity was put in a situation that requires them to act against their principles or beliefs, and that causes extreme internal conflicts. There was also an extended period of great stress for my colleague, and that played its part. And what we saw were changes in demeanour. So if we notice a person is they're not behaving, or their attitude is different from how we normally experience their behaviour, that can be a signal. Now, despite trying to hide his feelings, my ex-colleague, he exhibited a sense of frustration and futility mixed with the helplessness and anger. But those things only came up very briefly, and then he pulled them back down again, and almost like sort of holding it all in. So I mentioned about the attitude change. And like I said, there were short periods of time when those feelings, they were not present. You just didn't see them. And he was able to cram them back down again quickly. In his case, there was an increased stressor because of his position, his responsibility at work, which caused him such an enormous amount of stress. But the bigger problem was that in his line of work, he needed to appear as though he was in control or fine. So that meant that he had to strap everything down, strap his feelings down, and get on with the job, because that was what was expected of him. Now, it might seem like a strange thing that someone in an environment, whose sole purpose is to help people with mental illness, that a professional could commit suicide because of depression. Well, I am certain that if there were fewer stigmas attached to depression, if there was greater understanding within the workplace, any workplace, then people like my colleague, they might still be alive today. So just to round this off then, I want to point out that this is not an isolated incident in the health service. It should serve as an example of what can happen in any situation or environment, works environment, home life, wherever. And what determines the outcome is how we as individuals cope with extreme stress, which will vary greatly, and it depends entirely on the individual personality of the person. So we've learned quite a bit about depression, what it feels like, what it looks like, the whys and the wherefores. But I guess we need to know now, what can we do to help? So let's start to look at some of these areas, and hopefully we'll be able to sort of get a bit more clarity on this. So first of all, let's just look at this. Do you suspect that someone may be depressed? Okay, well, if you're listening to if you've listened to part 1 of the series, you'll know much more about depression. So what do you do if you see some of the signs of depression in someone? Do you ignore it? Well, I hope not. As an observer of someone else, taking the first step is not easy, but it needs to be done, and it needs to be done from a position of caring, and not from a position of a requirement or duty. You know, work environments are often places where concerns are more oriented to being productive and efficient, rather than the health of the staff. Now, and mental health is most certainly something that is rarely considered by employers. Now, I firmly believe that we each take a personal responsibility to care for each other, irrespective of rank or position. So let's assume we suspect that someone we know may be depressed. What do we do? Well, perhaps one of the first things that we should look at is, what is your relationship to this person? Is it a family member, work colleague? Is it your manager? Is it a friend, a fellow student? Maybe it's a child in your care, whether you're a teacher or otherwise. Maybe an employee of yours. So each one of these people, if you approach the person, it depends on your relationship to that person as to how you will approach them. And I can't go through each one of those. That's something that you need to think about for yourself. You need to be creative as to how you approach them. Like I said, but it has to come from a position or a place of caring. Now, of course, there is, depending on your position in the workplace, there is a sense of professional responsibility. I mean, some professions, they have a requirement by law to protect others while they're in their care, like teachers and doctors and nurses. The approach that they use to ask about depression may differ from others, simply due to their legal requirement to safeguard. But they will still, or they should still, have a friendly and caring and hopefully understanding approach. Now, what about friends and family or colleagues, people on a different level, if you like? Well, in the first instance, observation is the key, and that's observation by you. You've got to know something about depression to begin with, and that will help you identify possible signs. However, you don't want to be jumping in too soon. You know, only you can know the right time, but if you suspect a person has depression, then you can at least ask, are you okay? You've seemed a little down lately. I'm worried about you, or something like that. Very simple things, but they show you're caring and they're not being judgmental. They're asking, they're checking out. Now, at this point, we could actually veer off into discussing all the ways that you could talk to someone. However, that is a subject all by itself, and that's not really the purpose of this vidcast. It's often difficult to realise or accept that we are depressed. And it's understandable because, you know, we all have bad days, which is not depression. And if that extends to more than a couple of days, then we usually just accept it. I mean, it might take some time before, you know, the realization that there might be something more going on sinks in. But even when we have at least admitted to ourselves that we may be depressed, it's often then harder for some to seek help. But the thing is, it is imperative that the depression sufferer seeks help as soon as possible. Now, this means that it's up to the people around them to try and recognize that the person is depressed and actively encourage them to seek help. Now, please note I said encourage. That doesn't mean force, bully, or insist. So, what are the alternatives when it comes to treatment? Let's have a look at some of the common ones. So let's just assume that depression is already present. So whether you have it or someone else has it, but in this case we're talking about perhaps someone else. First thing that you would do is do nothing. Just let the person work through it. Sorry, but this is just not the way to go. And I think I've already demonstrated that it takes a great deal of training, self-awareness, understanding, just to go it alone. That's something that you know, having spent so many years of training in my profession as a therapist, I was able to find my way out of my depression, but I only had mild depression. I didn't get any help. I just relied on my training, and I was able to knock it on the head, but it still took me several years of dealing with it. So that was me on my own. So the next thing you can do is you can go and visit the doctor. You can go and see your general practitioner, which would be the first option. Now, I've worked alongside doctors in general practice for quite a number of years, and I'm not being disparaging about GPs, but their knowledge about depression, it varies greatly from almost nothing to not very much. Now remember, they are not specialists in mental health, okay? When they say general practitioner, that's what they are. They generally know a little about a lot of things. So when you go and see your GP, they might prescribe you with some antidepressant medication. Well, I would suggest that you need to look at your life circumstances and how much being depressed is affecting your life before taking medication. In the end, excuse me, it is your decision whether to take it or not. Now, when you visit the doctor, there is a good chance that you will end up with a combination of antidepressants and a referral for therapy. Now in Britain, we get referrals. You go and see your GP, and if they want to refer you to a psychological service, then the doctor sends off a referral and you end up at some point getting an appointment. So and again, it's your decision. You know, just because the doctor says that they recommend this, it is a recommendation. You must decide in the end. If your ability to think and function daily is significantly impaired, then, you know, taking the drug can be a good idea in the short term. I mean, what that does then is it tries to calm things down and give you some clarity of thought. And then engaging in an effective therapy, and I stress the word effective, once those drugs take effect, is a good idea, you know, just so that you can engage more in the therapy. So yes, if the doctor offers you antidepressants, then that's a short-term relief. A bit like you take a paracetamol for a headache, but it is not the cure. The next thing is I mentioned about going to see a therapist. Now, it will come under different names. I'm going to use the phrase counselling therapy. It's the one I'm used to. Now, in the health service in Britain, we have pretty good access nowadays to a variety of talking therapies. But a word of caution, not all talking therapies are equal. In Britain, for example, while the service is free, you generally don't get a choice of therapy. I mean, it's a case of you get what you're given, and not all therapies are effective. Certainly not all effective for everyone. Some of them are effective for some things, but not for others. Now, if you live in a country other than Britain, I can't know if talking therapies are free or not. My guess would be that most are not free. So counselling therapy or psychotherapy in Britain, they have waiting lists. So you might be in for a long wait to see a therapist. Alternatively, you could, if you've got a few pounds in the bank, go for private therapy. Now obviously, a visit to a therapist, there's a significant cost involved to do that. So I suggest that you don't just jump in at the first name that comes along. You've got to look for those people who are specialising in help with depression, for example. You need to take a look at how they work, phone them up, talk to them, or if you don't feel able to do it, then ask someone to do it for you. there's many different types of therapy available. So if you're going to pay for it, then you want to have the best chance for your recovery. So you have to do some checking out, which is not an easy thing to do when you're depressed, I know. But you need to find out, at the very least, if you like the person that you're talking to. If you do get to talk to them, very often therapists will give you a first session for free, so you have an opportunity to check them out a little bit, find out if you're comfortable with them, if they are judgmental with you, if they're condescending, if they say things that dismiss your feelings. If any of that is happening, then walk away. Even if you've already started sessions with them, remember, therapy is designed to challenge you. It will be difficult, but that doesn't mean to say that the person, your therapist, they must be respectful also. There are other places to go for therapy. You could try different charitable organizations, and often most of the time they're free. They may ask for a donation, of course. They're certainly worth approaching, and often the people who work for them are qualified in the therapy that they do. And of course the cost to you is going to be much less than it would be for a private therapist. So again, you'd need to search around and look around for local charitable organizations and see what you can find. Now, turning to your family and friends for support, this is irrespective of whether you've been to see the GP, got a private therapist or whatever. This is the one thing that is very important. Okay, you need to have the support of your family and hopefully friends as well, the closest people to you. I mean, in one way, that's the reason for this talk is to bring depression into people's awareness, to help them to understand it, because you, the family of a person who's depressed, are just as important as the therapist, because you're there to help the people have to feel comfortable, to feel as though that they have that support from people closest to them. So it's to help us all have a greater awareness of what depression is about, so that we can provide a more caring and empathic, understanding way of helping a person who's suffering from depression. So just listening to this short vidcast series about depression, that might be enough to raise your awareness of depression, and it might help to dispel myths of any preconceived ideas you've got about it. And this is just one way that we can help. And to reduce the time that a person experiences depression, we can all do something. You can assist with it. You can care for someone, whether you're at work or in your private life. So we were just talking about, if the depression is already present in a person, but what if it's not present? What can we do about prevention of the onset of depression? Well, let's first of all, let's have a look at the work environment to begin with. Everybody from senior executives downwards need to begin to realise that placing huge pressures on employees, especially if they are required to perform a variety of job roles, it causes huge internal conflicts. And expecting everyone to be able to cope, perhaps as you might, it's just not going to work, because everybody copes differently. Some people can handle the pressures and the stress, others cannot. And because a person may not be able to handle enormous pressures does not make them weak people. We need, certainly employers, need to develop a collective responsibility, we all do, to look after the employees. Instead of loading until they break down, humans can only take so much. And I know because I've been through it. And I've seen many others who struggle with stress of overburdening work, and it's just impossible to cope with for many. Other people have got no problem with it. So that doesn't mean that the people who are coping with it, they're not anxious, they're not stressed. Yeah, they are. So there's something else that we could actually do, and that is we need to spread the word. Now, I've mentioned previously that recent statistics say that, generally speaking, 1 in 5 people will experience depression at some time in their lives. 1/5 of people. So if you consider this fact, then when you look around your room, in the office, or wherever you are with people, you just imagine how many people will need help one day. And don't forget that includes you as well. So you can tell people what you've learned here. You can maybe try to put yourself in the shoes of a depressed person, and like I've been asking you to try and do here, and just feel a little bit of what it's like. Maybe you're having a glimpse of yourself will help you to be more understanding of others if you let it. Talk to people. If you think someone's having a problem, offer to help. Now, so let's move on to some more practical things to help those people with depression. And I know I feel maybe sometimes it might sound like I'm repeating myself here, but some of these things are so very important, and they really do need mentioning more than once. So perhaps the most useful thing we can do to help somebody with depression is to try and understand. I mean, that in itself, it's not as simple as it sounds, but we can make an effort. You know, if we take the time to listen to how they feel, you know, find out a little bit about how to do active listening. You don't have to become a therapist, you don't have to become a counsellor or whatever. Just learn a little bit about what it means to do active listening. You might want to ask them to help us understand what they're going through, because you don't know, so get them to tell you, or try to. You know, you could also, don't make assumptions about how you think they should feel. Just because you might feel a certain way, or you cannot know what another person is feeling unless they tell you, and even that's not an easy thing for them to do. Also, don't judge them. You know, comments like, "Oh, pull yourself together," or "What have you got to feel down about?" You know, oh, these are really extremely unhelpful comments. And well, I've kind of prepared you a little bit in this vidcast. Be prepared to hear the same things over and over. Yeah, don't get impatient with hearing, "I feel down today, I feel down today," etc., etc., because tomorrow will be the same as today for a person who's depressed. It may even be worse. So there's a host of things that you can do to help, and I've tried to boil them down just into a few ideas, some more practical issues now. So, for example, again, depending on your relationship, you could help them with their chores. You know, being depressed means doing anything. Maybe it's housework, or even cleaning the car, or whatever it is. You know, it can be a huge effort. So, showing we care enough to understand this, it will be appreciated. Go for a walk with them. Now, that might take some doing. I mean, getting a depressed person to actually go out of the house into the fresh air, but some gentle persuasion and, you know, some sweet talking, if you like, getting them out into the fresh air, it can be a kind of therapy in itself. You need to encourage people who are depressed. Encourage them to take care of themselves. Make sure that they shower, they get their hair cut, they have a shave and cut their nails and things like that. And this might be difficult, but compliment them. You know, there's always something that they manage to achieve, however small. "Oh wow, you know, Fred, you know, you managed to make yourself a pot of tea today. That was brilliant. Because I know yesterday you couldn't do that." Compliment. Show them that they are able to do things. They are not useless. And that means supporting them, doesn't it? You're supporting people, and you know, in all sorts of ways, and support them in that business of trying to get help. And so there we have it. That is about as much as I can say about depression in a vidcast. So I just hope that you will take on board the things that I've been talking about. Please go back over anything that I've talked about and just re-listen to it, if you can stand listening to my voice all of those times. But please, I hope you can take some of these things on board, and I hope that you will be able to help someone else or even help yourself. So we've come to the end of this presentation, and like I said, I hope you found it useful. My hope is that you never experience depression, and if you don't, well, the chances are that you will very likely come across a friend, a family member or a work colleague who does. So at least now you've got a greater insight into this problem, and your response to someone else's depression will be either a great hindrance or a great help in that person's recovery. It's up to you. The choice is yours. I just hope that you choose to be a help. So that's all for this time. Please look out for the third part to this series, where we will discuss more about personality development as it relates to depression in children. Yes, children get depressed too. Thanks for listening. See you then.